Hello, this is John Faithful Hamer, and you're listening to Catholic versus Protestant.
So just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, if you would, who you are, what you believe, and how you came to believe it.
Well, I teach at John Abbott College in the Department of Humanities, Philosophy, and Religion, and I've had a lifelong interest in religion. I come from a very religious family. What I believe has evolved over time, but I haven't really made sense of it yet. I'm wrestling with that all the way into my 40s still.
Can you touch just briefly on some of your earliest recollections of God and religion and what you witnessed around you, maybe in a grandparent or a parent or a sibling or someone that inspired you to think about the other world?
Well, I grew up in an environment which was kind of a mixture of Christianity and Buddhism and various kinds of Eastern myths. You know, that 1960s hippie hodgepodge, everything like a salad containing all these different things. And so I have a lot of fond memories of that sort of thing from when I was young. But the first time it became very serious for me was when I was 12 years old. I was getting into a lot of trouble, and I was kind of a pain, and I was in a single-parent household. My mom was raising the three of us by herself, me and my two little sisters. And I guess, I don't know it's hard to remember, but I guess my hormones were raging. I was a testosterone pumped teenager, and my mom didn't know what to do with me. And so she sent me down to live with my Uncle Peter for the summer, right after school finished. And he lived in a little town outside of Roanoke called Rocky Mount in Virginia. And I went down there, and I had a fantastic summer, one of the best summers of my life. My Uncle Peter had just got a new house, and he was doing all sorts of renovations and stripping the floors, refinishing them, painting, building stuff. And so the deal that we struck was that I would do a certain amount of work for him every day. I can't remember what it was. I think it was like I would do sort of 4 hours of work every day, and then the rest of the day was completely free. I could do whatever I wanted. And so for the most part, I would go off and wander around in the forest and find like box turtles and snakes and lizards and salamanders, and had all sorts of fun. But while I was down there, my Uncle Peter is a very devout Christian, an evangelical Protestant, and he went to church a lot. I mean, he still does, but he went to church a lot. Like, not just Sunday morning. It was like Sunday morning, Sunday night, Friday night, Wednesday night, a lot of church. And we're talking marathon services. I mean, when the Spirit would really move, you could be there on a Sunday night until well after midnight, and nobody was in any hurry to leave. It was just, it's like, I don't know, being like a rave or something, but I had never seen anything like that. I had never heard singing like that. It was just unbelievable, and the enthusiasm, the excitement. I mean, it's been over 30 years, and I can still remember it like it was yesterday. I mean, they were just phenomenal church services. I mean, to explain to somebody who's never experienced something like that, I guess the only comparison would be like Oceaga, or like a really fantastic concert, when you're seeing your favorite band and you're high on ecstasy or something. I don't know. It's completely amazing. But anyway, while I was down at my Uncle Peter's in Virginia, I got like saved, right? I became like a born-again Christian, and I came back as like a full-on Bible-thumping evangelical born-again Christian. I had been, converted. I came back and bought a suit at a secondhand place and started going to church all the time. So I immediately tried to find a spirit-filled church when I got back to Montreal. And through the grapevine, I was told that the one that I would really like was to go to Trinity Pentecostal Church in LaSalle, which was not very far away from where I lived in Verdun. And so I joined Trinity Church as soon as I got back. My mom was kind of shocked. I think she was, I think she was like a little bit ambivalent about it because I was a really preachy, kind of newly saved evangelical Christian where I was putting Bible verses up on the walls all over the house. It's like any, right? If you're a teenager, if you become a vegan, if you become, whatever you become when you're a teenager, you become like really obnoxious. So I was, like, do you remember that show Family Ties where Alex P. Keaton has these hippie parents and he becomes like a hardcore conservative who like has like a Richard Nixon like portrait on his like on his wall. Well, I sort of my mom was is a real kind of hippie, very left-leaning hippie, progressive type, and incredibly sweet, wonderful woman. So I think it was maybe the worst thing that could have possibly happened was me. Anyway, she was a practicing Tibetan Buddhist, and she went to a temple in Côte Saint Paul, just not far from where we lived. And so she went to the spiritual leader there, the sort of the equivalent of the priest, Geshe-la, and she said to Geshe-la, she said, I don't know what to do. John Faithful came back from the United States and he's this Bible thumping evangelical Christian, and I'm kind of freaked out. I don't know what this is. And Geshe-la's response was very wise. He said, your 12-year-old is interested in spiritual things. He's like, rather than doing drugs and causing trouble he's interested in transcendent things. He's in wisdom and knowledge and all. This is a great thing. You should be very, very thankful. And so she said that sort of allayed her fears and concerns, and she was very, very supportive, actually. I mean, when I was baptized into the church, she came and she was sitting right there in the front row, and she was beaming with pride. I gave a sermon one time. They wanted somebody from the youth group to give the Sunday night sermon one time, and so I volunteered to do it, and I gave the Sunday night sermon, and my mother, even though she wasn't a member of the church and she wasn't a Christian in any sense, she showed up, as if it was my ballet recital, and she was there sitting in the front row beaming with pride, so she was very supportive of it. So I guess that would be my first really induction into Christianity.
Do you remember hearing the story of your name? Who chose your names, John and Faithful, and who is the John that you were named for? Do you know the story?
So my grandfather was a very well-known pastor, an evangelical who had like a radio show and a Christian camp in a huge church on the West Island. And so my father grew up in an extremely religious household. He was the son of a preacher man, and he, in his own way, was also a preacher. But one of the books that he grew up on, aside from the Bible, was John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. And so he was naming me partially for Pilgrim's Progress, partially the John, right, St. John. And then Faithful was also because my mother's name is Penelope, which means faithful wife. Her name is Penelope Jane. And so the male version of Jane is John, apparently, and then Penelope means faithful wife, and so you invert those and you get John Faithful, and that's how I got my name.
What was your first encounter with the idea that there's a Catholic Church that sort of stands separate from the Reformation?
What I was told was, obviously in a very hardcore evangelical Protestant church, was that the Catholic Church was horrible and satanic and was run by all these like really intense conspiracy theories and all that stuff, right? So yeah, I guess that would be my encounter with Catholicism.
If you're not Catholic, I think you should be anti-Catholic, because if the real presence is not the case, then it's the greatest blasphemy, the doctrinal teaching of the real presence in the Eucharist. How can you possibly stomach that unless it's the truth?
Well, there's various ways that you can interpret it. I mean, like when I participate in the Eucharist, I feel a deep, deep connection to thousands, indeed, over 10,000 years of history, because that's something that goes right back to the agricultural revolution. It is way, way older than Christianity. It's way older than the sort of Egyptian antecedents of that. It goes far back. I mean, when we figured out how to grow things, one of the first things they did was they would have these festivals where you would have the god that gives its life for you, right, and then goes down into the ground and is reborn, right? And that's a very, I see Christianity as being essentially a very sort of pagan tradition, which comes out of the agricultural revolution. And so it's a new incarnation of a very ancient and powerful tradition.
But do you believe that there's no difference between the real presence and your Joseph Campbell view of the Eucharist?
I think it's important to respect transcendence, and I think if you get too dogmatic and too sort of obsessed with making an idol out of your own reason and your own logic and words and concepts, I think that's one of the most amazing things, one of the great innovations of the ancient Hebrews, I think, was the idea that you should not have any graven images, that you should not, I love the way Leonard Cohen, to his dying day, whenever he wrote God, he always wrote G-D, right? And the idea that like saying the name of God is incredibly sacrilegious, and that you should always allow God to remain beyond your words and beyond your capacity for images and beyond your logic. And so very often when I encounter like a really sort of dogmatic Christian, I find that to a large extent they're committing precisely the sins that Moses said you're not supposed to do.
You're sort of agreeing with me now that if you're not Catholic, you should be anti-Catholic, because the Catholic Church is dogmatic. I mean, you can't separate the Catholic Church from dogma. You just can't do it.
Oh, sure you can. There's a very significant percentage of people who go to church all the time who say privately that they don't believe in God, right? That they don't believe in heaven, that they don't believe in hell. So if you want to understand what a religious movement is about, the worst people to talk to are the slick apologists who've like memorized all the catechism and have their talking points, and they sound like sort of high-functioning autistic debate club presidents. And talking to those people is actually often the worst people to talk to, because they have an understanding of the faith which is usually not what the regular Rhonda and Joe average, their understanding of the movement. It's much better to try and talk to sort of the rank and file and see, what do you get out of this experience? What are you feeling, right? And they may not have the answers that you like. Very often they'll tell you, well, I come here because I love the community, or I come here because I feel a special affinity for the Virgin or for this particular saint, and I'm really praying to Francis. I'm not praying to Jesus, kind of thing.
Yeah. Speaking of the saints, you sort of talked about the uneducated masses on one end of the spectrum and then the slick apologists on the other end of the spectrum, and you completely left out the Catholic saints. The saints are the ones who are proposed to us by the Church as the ones to imitate. We're never told to imitate the ignorant masses, and we're never told to imitate the slick apologists. We're told to imitate always Jesus Christ and his saints.
Oh, I'm not saying to imitate the masses, right? I'm just saying it's very interesting to see what people want, what people get out of it.
The thing about the Catholic saints, if you're honest with yourself and you look at 2,000 years of Catholic saints, you'll realize that a lot of men were very holy, a lot of men were very Christian, and a lot of men were very good and devout, and they loved God and they loved the Church. But because they taught error, because they were wrong about one point of doctrine, They weren't canonized. So this tells you something about the relationship between the saints that we celebrate and that we're told to imitate and dogma, because this is really what we're trying to discuss here. Is my claim is that you can't separate dogma from the Catholic Church. Yeah, you can have a pro-choice Catholic, but that's completely missing the point. That's oxymoronic. That's a contradiction in terms. You know what I mean? We cannot violate the fifth commandment, right?
Hmm. Well, I mean, I've known very, very devout Catholics who were wonderful people and did a lot of really fantastic works. And, as Jesus says, by their fruits ye shall know them. He didn't say by their dogmas ye shall know them. And they did a lot of really fantastic things, and they were also pro-choice.
Yeah, if you don't know that what you're doing is wrong, then of course Jesus is very kind and merciful. And if these people, out of their own ignorance, invincible ignorance, they don't know that the fetus is a human being, then they're not doing anything wrong. Well, objectively speaking, they're doing something wrong, but subjectively speaking, it's not wrong because they're not violating their conscience. But I want to talk a little bit about your voyage from evangelical youth to where you are today. How do you label your Christianity today? I know it's a work in progress and that it's under development. But what can you sort of paint a broad picture of how you got from where you were to where you are today?
Okay, well, the broad picture is this, and I as I said, I really don't know how to make sense of this. But after I was saved when I was 12 in Rocky Mount, Virginia, I heard the voice of God when I prayed. Like, I heard a voice speaking back. I heard the voice of the Holy Spirit, and it was fantastic. But then one day, God just stopped talking to me. When I was about, I don't know, like 14, 15, it just suddenly, it was like Holy Saturday, right? The day that God was dead, right before the resurrection. Yeah, it was horrible. I mean, I felt very like abandoned. It was like it was like the worst breakup ever, right? Like I got dumped by Jesus, So I don't know. It was like trying to stay in a relationship with somebody that you've fallen out of love with. You're just going through the motions, but there's no conviction behind it anymore. And so finally I started to feel like more and more of a fraud. And I also felt sort of, in a sense, embarrassed because, there's that wonderful line when Jesus says to Stephen, doubting Thomas, where he says, blessed are those who believe even though they don't see, right? Like, who have faith. And I realized that I never really had faith in the sense that I think most Christians have faith. Like, I didn't have to, as an act of my will, decide to believe and, have faith. It was very, very real. Now I don't know how to make sense of that. Maybe I was having like a little bit of a psychotic episode. Maybe it was like a brush with schizophrenia. I really do not know how to make sense of the experiences I had during that time. But anyway, so eventually, after God stopped talking to me, I left the church. I stopped going, and I was out of it for about 12 years. Then, when my wife and I, she grew up as a Lutheran Protestant, and she taught Sunday school and all these things. So when we met, we were living in Baltimore, and she wasn't going to church at the time. She was in grad school, so was I. Then we got married, and then we moved to Montreal, and we decided we had our first son, Tristan, the one who fixed the microphone. Actually, he was born in Baltimore, but we moved to Montreal like a week after he was born. So, but we had talked about religion a great deal, and we wanted to raise our kids with sort of a spiritual foundation and talk to them about those kinds of things. But our plan was to sort of homeschool them, spiritually speaking, that we weren't comfortable with any of the churches on offer, and so we decided, well, we'll just teach them this stuff ourselves. Well, of course, they got to be 3, 4 years old, 5 years old, and it just never was happening. Like, we were never getting around to it. And so we realized, wow, it probably makes sense to actually be part of a religious community, which sort of makes it part of your routine. And so we started shopping around for a church. the ones that we agreed with intellectually and politically were really dead, and the ones that were really fun were politically kind of scary. So that was the problem. But we eventually found St. John's Lutheran, which is not far from us on John Moss and Prince Arthur, and it was just a perfect fit. It was very sort of high church, took the rituals very seriously, but was also intellectually really engaging, and fantastic music. I mean, the organists they've had since we've been there have been just, world class, fantastic. I mean, the guy that's there right now he's amazing, Joel Peters. Anyway, so we started going there, and the boys went through Sunday school, and they were both baptized, and then later on, Tristan went through confirmation class and was confirmed. Indy, our younger son, decided that he didn't want to. So that's how we ended up in the Lutheran Church.
So I want to ask you, what are the deal breakers doctrinally for you personally? Is it necessary that your church that you attend believes in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Is it necessary for you that they also believe that God is a triune God? What are the deal breakers? What are you not willing to compromise on in terms of Christian doctrine?
Well, I guess I would prefer the more sort of traditionalist approach, just because I don't know. I like classic Coke. I don't like touchy-feely, faddish Christianity where you're always pulling out your guitar and trying to be like some sort of hippie or something. I guess I prefer a more traditionalist approach, but I would mainly prefer a Christianity that is not very obsessed with doctrine. Because what I find, I must say, like, listening to your podcasts, one thing that struck me about your podcast is that in terms of emphasis, you seem, at least on the podcasts, to be actually quite Protestant, right? Because it seems, to me, one of the beautiful things about Catholicism, I mean, and I understand the Counter-Reformation was in a way kind of trying to fight fire with fire, and like, we will be more Protestant than the Protestants in terms of having all of our doctrine and rhetoric, and Loyola, like the Jesuits, we will like teach you how to be like a debate club president, and I understand why that happened, and I understand the necessity of that. I get it, but I think if you stress that, you miss what is really beautiful about Orthodox Christianity, about Catholic Christianity, which is that it's much more focused on ritual rather than dogma, and kind of the beauty of, and the mystery, and the, all that, the going into, I mean, what I love about Catholic churches is the grandeur. You go inside, and this just, beauty, and something that is, you really feel like you're going into like a portal into a completely different world. But if you get too mired down in doctrinal points, maybe it's fun for debating, but I think you're missing the biggest selling point of Christianity, and specifically of Catholicism.
The reason I'm doing the podcast is because I came to God through philosophy, and I enjoy ideas, and I'm a true philosopher in the sense, not that I'm bright, but that I love the truth. I really do love the truth. And I'm also convinced that we need to learn the truth, and that there are errors that can lead us away from Jesus Christ. If we have a wrong idea about Jesus Christ, then we aren't going to be able to get as close to Jesus Christ. So when I'm at church, I'm not debating, I'm not fact-checking, and I'm not the Grand Inquisitor. But when I'm discussing my faith with someone that has a different point of view, I want to bring that person in to unity with the Catholic Church, because I believe it's the one true church. So this brings me to the topic of unity. What is Christian unity for you? It can't just be everyone be nice and get along and don't worry about the doctrine, right? It can't just be kumbaya. Otherwise, you'd probably be a Unitarian Universalist or something like that.
That's one of the churches that we tried out, and we were just like, this is absolutely ridiculous. They have watered down the theology of the message so much that it just it lacks all of its power and all of its grandeur. It's, oh God.
So what is unity for you? What is Christian unity? Because Jesus Christ prayed that we shall be one, right? And yes, they will know that we are one by our love for each other, but we can't separate love from truth.
Well, I don't know what would be the unity. I guess probably a lot of it would be the universalistic message of it, which is really something that it comes from Paul, not from Jesus. As far as we can tell, Jesus was a Jewish radical who believed that he was starting a reform movement within Judaism to get them back to what mattered. And he was a Jew, and it was a message for other Jews, right? And then it's St. Paul who's responsible for inviting everybody into the party, right? Everybody to the club. And you can see in the book of Acts where he's arguing with people who are really not down with this. And there were people in the early Jesus movement who thought, no, this should remain a club that's exclusively for Jews. And if people are going to become Christians, they need to convert to Judaism, and they have to keep kosher, and they have to get circumcised, and all that stuff. So I think probably Christian unity would have something to do with agape, with the concept of agape, imagining a community that transcends tribal affiliations, right? That this is a generalized love of humanity. And I think that message at its best is what eventually leads to the universalistic human rights message. And I know very often there's this presented that there's this big opposition between Enlightenment values and Christian values. I don't see that there actually is as much of an objection, as much of a conflict between them as people very often say. I think actually, in many ways, the Enlightenment was a realization of a number of essentially Christian ideas. I mean, the whole idea, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. The whole idea of like trying to imagine a community that encompasses everybody. Those are essentially Christian ideas, right? So, yeah, I guess that would be my best like stab at it. But.
Well, I don't agree with you about Jesus not wanting to bring the non-Jews in, because if you read the Old Testament, it's prophesied time and time again that the non-Jews will be God's people, even though we know that the Jews are God's chosen people. But we also know that the Jews were a stiff-necked people, and we know that God wanted the entire race of Jews to be the priestly class, but then with circumstances, God cooperated with the rebellious Jews, and he reduced it to the Levites, and so on and so forth. There's always this remnant as the Jews rebel, and then the remnant passes along all the way down the lineage, and then the Messiah comes, and then everything's fulfilled. And part of that fulfillment entails the coming in of the non-Jews. And Paul talks about that very eloquently, about the reasons for that, and how all the Jews will come back into the fold, and how God has been cooperating with us throughout all of salvation history. And it's a very complex and messy affair. It doesn't negate the fact that the Jews are the chosen people, but God's cooperating with this stiff-necked people in a way that is most beneficial. So do you not see that, or do you have a different perspective on that?
Oh, I think for the most part, those passages in the Old Testament that are said to sort of foreshadow Jesus or foreshadow Christianity, I find them to be really implausible. I think it's much more likely that they refer to specific things that were happening at the time. And I think there's a wonderful line in Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil where he talks about how hysterical these Christian attempts to sort of go back into the prophets, and anytime there's a mention of a piece of wood, they automatically, that foreshadows the cross, and there's a mention, that foreshadows, and it seems very much like a wishful thinking, if you're trying to understand what's going on, it's much easier to explain that when the prophet Joel or the prophet Isaiah, when they talk about something, they're talking specifically about Babylon. They're talking specifically about present struggles that the Jewish people at the time were dealing with. And I'd find it very implausible that those things foreshadow Jesus. And I don't see evidence that that Jesus saw himself as anything other than a Jewish reformer. I think Christianity is, as we know it, is largely the brainchild of St. Paul, right? I don't think obviously Jesus is the main character of the movie, but the screenplay was written by St. Paul. Like if it wasn't for Paul, Jesus would have been just another one of the dozens and dozens of Messianic Jewish reformers that came on the scene between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century.
So you don't believe he's the Messiah?
Well, I wouldn't say that, right? I wouldn't say that. I'm just saying that the message has come to us because of Paul, and so I think it's important to give him credit for that and to understand that, like, a lot of what we like and dislike about the movement is really about Paul.
Do you believe that Jesus is the Messiah?
I don't know. I mean, like, that's, again, this is like one of those doctrinal questions that how should I put it? It seems to me like there's some questions where having any opinion on them should be a source of embarrassment. Like if somebody asked me, like, which bikini do you think looked better on Kim Kardashian, I would say, like, if you've actually given that some serious thought and you have an answer to that question, that's the problem.
Well, the Catholic Church teaches it's that pink one with the lace.
I just, on a lot of doctrinal questions, I just think there's no way. I don't have the information, the knowledge that I would need to have.
That's why I do the podcast, because I want people to have the information.
Maybe you have it. Maybe you've had some special revelation. But I don't have access to the kind of information that would allow me to, like, say definitively.
Well, I can say definitively that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. And the reason I can say that is because I participate in the infallibility of the church. I have a passive infallibility. So when I faithfully regurgitate the dogmas, it's infallible. It's a passive infallibility. Now, the church is actively infallible, meaning that it's protected by the Holy Spirit from teaching error concerning faith and morals. And one of those dogmas is that the Bible is inerrant. It's inerrant. There's no error in the Bible, Old Testament and New. There's 73 books in the canon of Scripture. Do you believe that the Bible's inerrant, and do you believe that there is a canon of Scripture?
No, I believe with St. Thomas Aquinas and with the great reformer Martin Luther, and with, Augustine also believed this. What you're talking about is a very recent doctrine that does not have a lot of heavyweights behind it at all. But I believe that the Bible was written by imperfect men inspired by a perfect God.
That's what I believe too.
Everything human, ugly and beautiful, is in there.
But the point is that they didn't write anything that God didn't positively want them to write. And St. Aquinas and St. Augustine are on the record as saying that there is no error in Holy Scripture. So I don't know what you're talking about. Can you back up your statement that Aquinas and Augustine...
I don't have the particular...
But what's the gist of it?
The gist of it was talking about that in exegesis, you have to try and... The process is you have to try and understand what was the kernel of inspiration and truth that was there, what was intended, right? And you have to get to that, you have to get through the dross of human language, human language is by definition an imperfect instrument. And so that's why you need to be reading you have to pray for the guidance of the Holy Spirit, because if you don't have that guidance, if you're just going based on the language is imperfect, and so you'll never be able to perfectly. It's like when Paul says in Corinthians, now we see through a glass darkly, right? But we will see perfectly. And the understanding was that this was very much a problem of language and of expression. The Neoplatonists were very good on this question. Like, they said that the purpose of of Scripture, which is very similar to the purpose of, let's say, a Platonic dialogue, is you point towards the sun. I mean, you've heard this example, right? You point towards the sun. Now, if you see somebody pointing towards the sun, do you stare at the pointer, or do you look at what they're pointing at and you look at the sun? Well, obviously, you turn around and you look and see what they're pointing at. So any kind of text, whether it be something in the Bible or whether it be in a work of philosophy, if it's really good stuff, it's going to be like somebody standing there pointing at something, right? And it's you have to turn and look at that thing, right? There's no, if you just are fixating on the pointer, you're never going to be really understanding what's said, right? And it's similar to the example that I give to my students often, as I say, if you have somebody who is born blind, how would you explain the color blue to somebody who's never seen anything blue? It's actually impossible. No matter how much I talk, I cannot explain to you what blue is, right? Likewise, if you haven't seen the spiritual truths that are spoken about in let's say, in the Gospels, this is why Jesus constantly says, "He who has ears, let him hear." Right? He is, and again, there's these references to that only people who have the right kinds of ears will hear the message. Only people who are, all right, only if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you must become like a child, right? Well, what he means by that is that you have to be looking at things in the right way, right? In the way that a child would look at them, right? With a certain kind of openness and trust and faith and naivete, the way when a kid looks at, when it's snowing for the first time, that look of complete wonder, right? So you have to be, right? So I would say likewise, if you get too obsessed with dogma and with words and with like playing with logic and reason and stuff like that, you can trick yourself into believing that, like I would say that, I don't want to sort of doubt what you say about how you came to your faith, but I suspect that you coming to your faith was not just through deduction and logic. I think you saw the blue sky.
Of course.
And now you basically, now that you've had that sort of glimpse into something transcendent and completely beyond words, you can try to put it into words. There's a really good book on this that sort of talks about the cutting. It's called Surfaces and Essences. My son Tristan recommended it, and I read it. It's a fantastic book. But it talks about how thinking works, and he says thinking works by analogy. So once you have seen a blue sky, once you have that concept, blue, you can do all sorts of things with it, right? Once you're, as a little kid, when you bump into a brick wall, you now have the concept of hard, right? Cold, hot, all these things. But those experiences, you absolutely have to have them in order to build onto that. So, for instance, I teach a class at John Abbott College called Love and Friendship. And I ask students in the first class, I say, like, how many of you have been in love at least once in your life? And I say, if you have not been in love thus far in your life, you should drop this class now and take something else. Because we're going to be talking about this experience and trying to make sense of it, and we're going to be talking about it. But if you haven't had the experience of it, there's absolutely nothing that I can say. There's no amount of like rhetoric, there's no amount of like words that can convey to you what that is, because it's a very, very powerful human experience, and it's not analogous to the love that you feel for your mother or your siblings or your best friend or something like that. It's something completely different, and you have to have had that. It's similar to the blue sky, right? If you haven't seen anything blue, we can't have an intelligent conversation about blue things.
Well, you tried to filter your students, but I think you missed an important nuance, which is that a lot of people mistake infatuation for love, and they mistake their own selfish desires and their own self-love for something that is truly selfless, especially if these are young adults, right? So I don't see the point in filtering when you're straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel.
But I don't think romantic love is selfless. I don't think it's selfless at all.
Okay, just ask if anyone's seen porn, then they're good to go. They can be in your class.
Yeah, it's. I think romantic love is a very, initially at least, is a very obsessive, powerful thing. It's all encompassing. You can't think about anything else. You're totally, drawn to the person. It's yeah.
The other thing I would say is I think we can inspire love through education. We can inspire love. This is the whole point of having religious education, is to foster and nurture love of God, right? But I wanted to talk about authority. By what authority do you interpret these scriptures, and why do you limit yourself to these religious texts, or do you? Do you draw religious inspiration from other religious texts?
Well, I think, I grew up with Joseph Campbell. I read his book when I was 10, 11 years old, and I loved it. I read The Power of Myth, and then I went and read like a bunch of his other books, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and I was really obsessed with Joseph Campbell for a little while. But I came to the conclusion that just doesn't feel genuine. It doesn't feel real. It feels very fake and phony. Like when you go to a wedding and they've got like a reading from Corinthians, and then they've got like a Navajo, prayer, and then they've got like their line from Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, and they've got like, so it just feels completely false and phony. And I feel like I am, for various reasons, I have grown up within a Christian, like a Judeo-Christian tradition. That is even if you're an atheist in our society, you are still powerfully affected by the Judeo-Christian tradition. So I think it's the tradition that speaks to me most. It feels most like home. I've read the sacred Hindu texts, and I've even taught on them, on the Bhagavad Gita, on the Upanishads, on various other works in Eastern religions, and then also on the Quran. And I see like a lot of beauty in some of those other traditions, but none of them feel like home, despite all of its Iron Age goriness and craziness. And I find the Bible is the tradition that feels most like home to me. So that's the one that speaks to me the most. I'm not saying that it's necessarily the best or anything like that. It's the one. It's like the English language or driving on the right side of the road. It just feels like home to me.
Yeah. I am going to let you go soon, but I wanted to get your point of view about heaven, hell, purgatory, the general judgment, the particular judgment, everything like that, the sort of the end times. What do you believe, or what do you hope for? And what do you fear?
That's another one of those questions where I just think like, Kim Kardashian's bikinis.
You spend a lot of time thinking about her bikinis, don't you?
I think it's embarrassing if you have an answer to that question.
What do you think about the 10 Commandments? Do you think that you should strive to keep the 10 Commandments?
Well, some of them. I mean, some of them are pretty terrible. I don't think those things apply to an Iron Age tribe that regularly engaged in ethnic cleansing and stoning people to death and doing some pretty terrible things. So, yeah, I don't worry about having that as being an ethical compass. But in terms of end times and all that stuff, it seems to me that God, as we understand God, is a manifestation or a personification of life on earth. So if that's true, then the God that I believe in was born whenever life emerged miraculously on earth, and will eventually die whenever the sun destroys the earth, millions of years in the future. I don't know. It seems to me like God is this force which is life, the life on earth, and is constantly sort of like a shapeshifter. 1 minute it's a dinosaur, next minute it's a fern, next minute it's a tree, next minute it's a groundhog, and a person, and it's all these different faces, right? So, but I don't actually. You know what? Seriously, that's just me sort of imagining poetically what this might mean. The truth is, when it comes to metaphysical matters, I don't know, and I don't understand unless you've had visions yourself and you've seen the blue sky, so to speak. You've seen these things. You've seen angels and demons. You've gone up the stairway to heaven and had these wonderful experiences. Unless you've had direct access to this sort of thing, I don't understand how anybody could have an opinion on those questions.
It's called faith. What do you think about pantheism?
Pantheism?
Yeah, are you comfortable labeling yourself as a pantheist or no?
No.
Because it sounded very pantheistic what you were talking about life.
No, I don't. Temperamentally, I like the idea of monotheism.
God is transcendent, in your opinion?
Yeah, I just like it to be a big sort of question mark, right? Like something that I don't understand and that I can't understand, and it's okay. It's good for there to be things in your life that remain unsolvable X's, right?
If someone came to you and said, I want to be a better Christian, what advice would you give? Just 3 bullet points. Bing, bang, boom.
Treat other people the way you would want people to treat you, right? And try very, very hard to see the divine in other people and to see other people as beautiful creations, beautiful that have the spark of the divine in them, no matter how much they enrage you or how many horrible things that they've done, to try and see some sort of spark of something beautiful within them and something valuable and something redeemable within them. I think that's the message of oneness and redemption is something that is extremely powerful. Yeah, you can even see this in like Marvel comics, the Spider-Man series where there's like Sandman and at the end he's redeemed. I find that just absolutely beautiful plot twist in that story that it's not as if there's these people that are ultimately evil to the core. It's that everybody has these good and evil tendencies within themselves and they make decisions which shape their character for good or ill. But even at the last minute, like the thieves being crucified on the other side of Jesus, like at the last minute, right? One of them repents and he says, you'll be with me in paradise shortly. Like, I love that idea that nobody is beyond saving, that nobody's beyond redemption. I find that to be a very beautiful, powerful idea.
You talked a little bit, I'm going to wrap things up now, but early in the interview, you talked a little bit about what might have been a psychosis in your early life. Mental illness is something that's always on my mind because it runs in my family. So I like to give a little positive message of hope at the end of all my interviews. So what would you say to someone that might be out there listening now?
Summer is coming.
If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, yeah.
Yeah, well, no, but I mean it both literally and figuratively. Like however bad things are at the moment, like this will pass. It won't be forever. I mean, the thing that really can cause people to despair when you're in the grips of a really bad depression or in the midst of a really bad psychotic episode, or even just when people bad trip on drugs, like on LSD or mushrooms or even weed if they do enough of it. When people bad trip on drugs, and when you talk to them about what is it about that experience that made it so terrible and unbearable, they almost always tell you the same thing. They say, I suddenly thought, oh my God, I'm going to be like this forever. I've broken my brain and I'm going to be stuck in this terrifying, horrible place forever, right? And that is the exact thought that kills people when they're in the depths of depression. They think, oh my God, I'm going to be in this pit forever. This is never going to change. I remember my cousin was, he died recently, but he had schizophrenia. And I remember talking to him about this, and he said exactly the same thing. He said, the thing that's so depressing and causes me to despair so much when I'm in a really bad place is I think I'm going to be here forever. I'm stuck here. So I think the best message you can tell to somebody who's really depressed or feels like they're losing their mind or they're bad tripping is you're not going to be like this forever. This is going to pass. Like this, the way you're feeling right now, the place you're in, this is going to pass. Right. So I would say that.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you've got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is